James Miller had always known that his path would lead him into the service of others. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood, he'd been surrounded by the loud hum of community and the distant echo of sirens. Firefighting was in his blood. His father had been a firefighter, and his grandfather too. Now, at 32, James had already spent 8 years fighting flames, rescuing lives, and working tirelessly to keep his city safe. It wasn't easy. Long shifts, dangerous calls, and the constant stress of life-or-death situations had shaped him into a man who was both fearless and humble. On the outside, he was tall, muscular, and confident. But inside, there was a quiet determination to prove that his worth wasn't defined by the color of his skin. His best friend, Mike Carter, had joined the force a year after James. Mike was the complete opposite, blonde, light-eyed, and quick to crack a joke. But despite their differences, they'd become inseparable. Mike often joked that if James ever took a break, it was only because he was too stubborn to admit it. One warm afternoon in early spring, the team gathered around the break room of Station 22, a small but vital hub of the fire department. There was a palpable energy in the air. The annual professional firefighting competition was coming up, and the whole station was gearing up for it. It was a big deal, an opportunity to showcase the department's finest. James had always been driven by the challenge. He'd trained for months, sharpening his skills, studying new techniques, and working tirelessly to stay in top form. He was confident that this year he could win, not just for himself, but for the entire team. "Are you ready, Miller?" Mike teased, sipping his coffee. "I'm not sure you can keep up with me this time. I've been hitting the gym extra hard." James grinned. "You've been hitting the donuts, you mean? I've seen you sneak that extra jelly-filled one." "Guilty," Mike laughed. "But hey, it's all about the balance. You keep doing your pull-ups, and I'll keep saving my strength for the competition." As their laughter filled the room, their supervisor, Edward Walker, walked in. Edward was in his 50s, a man who had seen it all in his decades of service. His face was stern, his posture rigid. He had a reputation for being a fair but tough leader, one who demanded respect but earned it in return. "Listen up, everyone," Edward began, his voice commanding attention. "This year's competition is crucial. We need to show the other stations what we're made of. I want everyone to give their best. I've got a few names in mind for the competition team, but I'll be watching everyone." James felt a brief surge of excitement, hoping his name would be on that list. He'd been working hard, and this was his moment. "James," Edward's voice cut through the noise, turning James's attention to him. "I'm afraid I won't be putting you on the team this year." The words hit James like a punch to the stomach. He blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Excuse me?" James asked, his voice steady, but with a hint of disbelief. Edward looked at him with an almost unreadable expression. "I've reviewed your performance, and while you're a good firefighter, I have reservations about your ability to perform under pressure in a public setting. This competition requires more than just physical strength. It's about precision, timing, and keeping your cool. I don't think you're quite ready for that." James's mind raced. There was no way he had misunderstood. He had trained tirelessly for this moment. The competition was the one thing that truly tested everything he had learned, and now Edward was telling him he wasn't good enough. "Sir, I've been working with this team for years. I've faced fires, rescues, and dangerous situations. I'm ready," James said, his voice even but firm. Edward's gaze softened, but his decision was final. "It's not personal, James. I just don't think this year is your year." James clenched his fists, trying to swallow the frustration that was bubbling up. Mike, who had been silent until then, stepped forward. "Sir, I'm sure James is up to the challenge," Mike said, his tone pleading. "We've seen him handle everything, and I know he's more than capable of competing." Edward shook his head. "It's not up for debate. I've made my decision." As the meeting ended, James stood motionless, trying to process what had just happened. He could feel the weight of the injustice pressing down on him. He had been passed over, not because of his skill, but because of something deeper, something that had nothing to do with firefighting. Mike placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'll have your back, man," he said quietly. James nodded, but his heart was heavy. This wasn't just about the competition. It was about proving to everyone, and to himself, that he could rise above the challenges, no matter how much they tried to hold him down. The days following the meeting were long for James. His mind wandered constantly back to Edward's words, replaying them over and over, trying to make sense of them. James was an experienced firefighter, respected by his colleagues and trusted with the most dangerous assignments. He knew that this competition was a way for the department to showcase its best, and he had worked hard for the chance to prove himself. Yet here he was, sidelined for reasons that seemed impossible to understand. At first, it felt like a cruel joke, but as the hours passed, the reality began to set in. It wasn't just about the competition. It was about something much deeper, something James had always known but had tried to ignore. The fire department, like many institutions, wasn't free of prejudice. The next day, James arrived at the station early, just as the sun began to rise. He tried to put on a brave face as he walked into the locker room, but his mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. His fellow firefighters exchanged greetings, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. The subtle glances, the half-smiles that didn't reach their eyes, they all reminded him of the invisible walls that still existed within the firehouse. "Hey, James, ready for the competition?" Mike asked as he walked over to his friend, sensing the tension in the air. James forced a smile. "Yeah, I guess I'm ready. Just need to figure out a way to make myself useful around here." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Don't let it get to you, man. You've been through worse." James sighed. "It's not about me, Mike. It's about the fact that I've been here for 8 years. I've fought fires in this city, saved lives, and yet I'm being told I'm not good enough. It's not just about this competition. It's about something bigger, something that goes deeper than my skills." Mike's expression softened. "I get it, I do. But you know, sometimes it's not about what you think is fair. It's about playing the game, even when it doesn't make sense." James nodded but didn't respond. He didn't want to hear about games or playing by someone else's rules. He had worked too hard for that. But before he could say anything, the sound of the bell rang, signaling an emergency call. "Let's get to work," Mike said, grabbing his gear. The rest of the shift was a blur. Calls came in one after another. A car accident here, a small fire there, but nothing compared to the events of the next day. The next afternoon, as James was reviewing his equipment and preparing for another training session, a loud alarm pierced the air, cutting through the hum of conversation. A fire had broken out in a residential area near the outskirts of the city. The location was a few blocks away from a neighborhood that James knew well. It was the kind of area where families had lived for generations, where everyone knew each other. This wasn't just another call. This was personal. The fire department sprang into action, and the crew raced to the scene. The streets were crowded with onlookers, their faces etched with concern. As the fire trucks pulled up to the scene, James could feel the familiar rush of adrenaline. "Get in line, Miller," Edward barked, his voice sharp, though his eyes didn't meet James's. James ignored the sting of the words, focusing instead on what mattered. He grabbed his gear and rushed toward the building. The flames were already licking the sides of the house, climbing up to the second floor, and smoke poured from the windows. James had fought fires before, but this was different. This fire was spreading too quickly, too violently. He could hear the sound of glass shattering as the fire consumed everything in its path. The house belonged to the Smith family. James knew them well. He had helped them with small things over the years, fixing their mailbox, shoveling snow off their driveway in winter. They were good people. He couldn't let this house go down, not if he could help it. As he charged toward the front door, he spotted a familiar face. A woman standing in the yard, her face streaked with tears. It was Rebecca Smith, her eyes wide with terror. "Where are they?" James shouted over the roar of the fire, his voice urgent. Rebecca's voice cracked as she pointed toward the second floor. "My husband, my kids, they're still up there. Please save them." James didn't hesitate. He sprinted up the front steps and pushed through the smoke-filled doorway. The heat was unbearable, but James had been through worse. His training kicked in as he moved swiftly through the house, following the heat to the staircase. He could hear faint coughing and the cries of children, coming from upstairs. In that moment, James's mind went blank. There was only the fire, the screams, and the lives at stake. He climbed the stairs with every ounce of strength he had, his vision blurred by the smoke. The fire was closing in, but he kept moving. At the top of the stairs, he found them. Tommy and Ella, crouched in a corner, their faces pale with fear. "Mom! Dad!" they screamed as they saw him. "Stay low!" James shouted, grabbing their hands. He turned to head back toward the stairs, but as he did, the wall on the far side of the hallway cracked and exploded into flames. The staircase was blocked. James quickly scanned the room and found another exit, a window that opened onto the roof. "Grab onto me," he said urgently, pulling the children toward the window. The heat was unbearable, but there was no time to waste. They had to escape. James guided them out, one by one, onto the roof. It was dangerous, but it was their only option. He motioned for them to stay low, then turned back to find Rebecca's husband, Tom. The minutes felt like hours as James fought his way back into the inferno. The air was thick with smoke, the fire licking at his skin as he moved through the burning house. His heart pounded in his chest as he heard Tom's frantic calls for help. Time was running out. James's heart thundered in his chest as he sprinted back through the burning hallway, the smoke stinging his eyes and making it hard to breathe. The fire was rapidly consuming the house, its roar deafening. He could hear nothing but the crackling flames, the creak of the house settling under the heat, and his own labored breathing. But somewhere deep in his mind, he could hear the frantic cries of Tom Smith, the father of the family, echoing through the chaos. "Help! Please! Somebody help!" Tom's voice was a panicked rasp from the floor above. James didn't hesitate. He knew the layout of the house well. He'd been there many times before, for barbecues, neighborhood gatherings, and casual visits. The hallway upstairs was already partially collapsed, but there was no time to waste. He rushed to the staircase, trying to assess the situation. The bottom part was engulfed in flames, but James could see through the smoke that the upper part of the stairs was still intact, just barely. If he was quick enough, he could make it. With one final breath of resolve, James charged up the stairs. The heat intensified with each step. He could feel his boots scorching the floor beneath him. As he reached the top, his eyes darted toward the open door of the master bedroom, where Tom had last been seen. Through the smoke, he could make out the figure of Tom, coughing, stumbling toward the window. "Tom!" James shouted, his voice strained but firm. Tom turned, his face haggard and covered with soot. His eyes were wide with fear. "James, you have to get out. It's going to collapse. You'll never make it." The sound of the house groaning under the pressure of the fire only added to the urgency. James didn't have time for any more words. He charged into the room, his eyes scanning for any signs of escape. Tom had already made his way to the window, but there was no way for either of them to safely reach the ground from that height. James cursed under his breath. "We need to get to the roof!" James yelled, grabbing Tom by the arm and pulling him toward the window. "Come on now!" Tom shook his head. "It's too dangerous. I'm not leaving my wife and kids out there." But there was no time for an argument. The smoke was thickening, the fire creeping closer to them. James's own instincts were sharp enough to recognize that the house was minutes away from total collapse. Every second counted. "Tom, listen to me." James's voice was fierce as he pulled Tom toward the window. "You have to trust me. Your family is waiting for you, and they need you to make it out. We need to get out of here now." Without another word, Tom hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. He placed his hands on the window frame and tried to climb out, but the heat had made the air unbearable, and the roof was a slippery, dangerous slope. James followed, helping him up, until they both managed to get to the top of the roof. The moment they were on solid ground, James turned back toward the burning house. The smoke was thick, and the fire was spreading too quickly. They didn't have much time. "Where are the kids? Where's Rebecca?" James shouted, trying to locate the others through the haze of smoke. "They're down there, on the lawn!" Tom's voice was frantic. He pointed toward the street below, where James could just barely make out the silhouettes of Rebecca and the children standing in a group, watching the house burn. James let out a breath of relief. They had made it out. But before he could feel any sense of accomplishment, his attention was drawn back to the house. The roof creaked ominously, and the structure seemed to be swaying. He knew that if they stayed there too long, they'd be trapped by falling debris. "We need to move, now!" James barked, pulling Tom toward the edge of the roof. "Can you make it down to the ground?" Tom nodded, his face a mix of exhaustion and terror. He seemed dazed but nodded again. James helped him over the edge, watching as Tom began to carefully lower himself to the ground below. He followed closely behind, trying to keep his balance on the steep incline. When his feet hit the grass, he immediately turned toward the family, who were still standing off to the side. Rebecca was still clutching Ella and Oliver tightly, her eyes wide with shock, but she was safe. James's heart pounded with a mixture of relief and dread. The fire was far from over, and they had all been incredibly lucky. They wouldn't be so lucky if they stayed any longer. "You're safe," James said as he rushed toward them. "Stay low and get as far away from the house as you can." Rebecca, her eyes filled with gratitude and exhaustion, nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Thank you for saving us. I don't know what we would have done without you." James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced back toward the burning house. He knew they had made it out, but there was no time to relax. The fire was still raging, and he needed to make sure no one else was left inside. But before he could head back toward the house, he heard a voice calling from behind. "James, where are you going?" It was Mike. James turned to see him sprinting toward him, his face grim as he scanned the scene. Mike had been assigned to another part of the fire, but it was clear he had spotted James in the midst of the chaos. "I need to make sure everyone's out," James said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "You stay with them. Keep them safe." Mike hesitated, glancing back toward the fire. "You're crazy, man. That place is going to collapse any second." "I can't leave anyone behind," James replied, his voice firm. Without another word, he turned and ran back toward the house. The fire was much worse now. The flames had grown even more intense, and the entire structure was beginning to collapse in on itself. James had to move quickly. He darted back toward the front door, the smoke choking him, but he refused to let fear take over. As a firefighter, he had faced many life-threatening situations. But now, his concern wasn't about his own safety. It was about making sure the Smith family's nightmare ended with them safe. Just as James reached the door, he heard the sound of creaking wood above him. The roof was beginning to cave in. Without thinking, James sprinted inside, his eyes watering from the smoke. He had to be quick. The house was a tinderbox now, and any second it could come crashing down. He searched the rooms, making sure there was no one left, no one who had been overlooked in the confusion. He moved as fast as his body would allow, but the smoke was becoming unbearable. He could barely see his own hands in front of him. In one last desperate search, James found a small, blackened stuffed bear lying on the floor. Ella's. He couldn't leave it behind. He grabbed the toy, his heart pounding as he hurried back toward the door. The house groaned as if it was taking its last breath. He couldn't risk it. He sprinted toward the exit just as the roof began to give way, crashing behind him. He barely made it outside in time, the heat from the collapsing structure scorching his back. The Smiths were safe, but James knew he had made it just in time. Barely. The sound of the collapsing house echoed through the street as James staggered out into the fresh air. His breath was ragged, his lungs burning from the smoke, but he didn't stop. His feet hit the ground as he rushed toward the Smith family, clutching Ella's stuffed bear in his hands. It was the only thing he had managed to grab in the chaos, an innocent piece of the family's life that had been left behind in the fire. As he reached the family, he handed the toy back to Ella, who looked up at him with wide eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the bear tightly to her chest. James smiled faintly, though he felt the weight of the entire situation pressing down on him. The fire was still raging behind him, but the Smith family was safe now. For the moment, that was enough. Rebecca, standing close by with her 2 children in tow, looked at James with eyes full of emotion. She had watched him run into the flames to save her family, and she had no words to express her gratitude. "You saved us," she said softly. "I don't know how to thank you." James shook his head, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "No need. It's my job." But it wasn't just his job. James knew that. It was more than that. It was the feeling of duty, the call to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. It was the instinct to run into danger when everyone else ran out. And as much as he had tried to ignore it, he now realized something else. He wasn't just saving lives because it was his job. He was doing it because, deep down, he wanted to prove something to himself, to the world, to the people who doubted him because of who he was. The fire raged on behind them, and James could feel the heat from the blaze as it licked the night sky. He stood there for a moment, watching the destruction, before turning to Mike, who had approached with a group of other firefighters. "Everyone's out," Mike said, his voice grim. "The structure's gone. We've got it under control, but there's nothing left to save." James nodded, glancing over his shoulder at the house that had once been a home, now reduced to ashes. The smell of burnt wood filled the air, but he could smell something else beneath it. A sharp, metallic scent that was unmistakable. It wasn't just the house that was burning. It was the memories of a family's life. Every object, every picture frame, every keepsake, they were all gone. In that moment, James knew how much he had risked to save the family. And though it had been worth it, there was a sense of loss that lingered in the air, one that would not easily fade. Mike clapped James on the back, shaking him from his thoughts. "You did good, man. You saved them. That's what matters." But James couldn't shake the feeling of something gnawing at him deep inside. They had survived, yes, but the cost was high. They had lost everything. The house, the memories, the comfort of knowing they had a place to call home. And as much as James wished he could give them that back, he knew it was beyond his control. "We should get them to the hospital," Mike continued, his tone more serious. Everyone looks like they could use a checkup. I'll make sure the paramedics are on their way. James glanced over at the Smith family. Rebecca was holding her children close, trying to comfort them, but her face was drawn with exhaustion. She had lost everything in that fire. Everything except her family. And that, in the end, was what mattered most. Yeah, James said quietly. Let's make sure they're okay. As the paramedics arrived and began to check over the family, James stepped back, allowing them space to work. He felt a sense of quiet pride in his heart. They were safe. They had made it out. But he couldn't stop thinking about the one thing that had been gnawing at him since he had first entered the building. The moment when he had heard Edward's voice in his head. "You're not good enough." James had heard those words so many times, both from Edward and from others, some of whom didn't even realize they were speaking from a place of prejudice. He had been passed over for the competition, not because of his skills, but because of his race. He had been told time and again that he wasn't what they were looking for, and each time the words stung deeper. But now, standing here, knowing he had just risked his life to save a family, those words felt small, insignificant. He had done his job, he had been the hero, and as much as the system had tried to hold him down, it couldn't take away the truth of his actions. "James," Mike's voice broke through his thoughts again. "You all right, man?" James nodded, though his chest was tight. "Yeah, just thinking." "You've earned your place, brother," Mike said with a grin. "You don't need a competition to prove that." James glanced at him, a small smile playing on his lips. "Thanks, Mike. But you know it's not just about the competition." Mike nodded, his grin fading into something more serious. "I know, man, I know." The next few days passed in a blur for James. He had barely caught his breath before the news of his heroic actions spread throughout the city. News stations, social media, and even local politicians praised him for his bravery. The mayor of the city held a press conference, recognizing James and the rest of the firefighters who had responded to the fire. The Smith family, now homeless but grateful, spoke publicly about their gratitude toward James for saving their lives. It was all happening so fast. James wasn't used to the attention, the accolades, or the praise. It wasn't why he did what he did. But as much as he tried to ignore it, the recognition brought with it a sense of validation he hadn't realized he needed. The voices of doubt, both from others and from within, began to fade. He had done something that mattered. He had saved a family. He had earned his place. But despite the accolades, James knew something had changed inside him. The fire he had faced that day wasn't just in the building. It had been within himself. The way he had always doubted his worth, the way the system had tried to define him, it had all come to a head. And now, he understood. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He just needed to keep doing what he did best. He didn't need the competition to prove he was the best firefighter. He was already that. The next few days after the fire were a whirlwind. The Smith family had been relocated to a temporary shelter while the insurance claims were processed, and arrangements were made for them to stay with relatives until they found a more permanent home. The community rallied around them, donating clothes, food, and funds to help them get back on their feet. But it wasn't just the Smiths who were receiving attention. James was everywhere. The local media had latched onto the story of the brave firefighter who had risked his life to save an entire family. Every news station had his face plastered on their screens. Every newspaper had his photo on the front page. The city had turned its gaze on him, and for the first time, he felt like he was truly being seen. The city's fire department had arranged a ceremony to honor the men and women who had responded to the blaze, but the spotlight was firmly on James. He had become a symbol of courage and resilience, a hero who had faced the fire head-on, not just for the Smiths, but for the entire community. In a way, it was everything he had ever wanted, to be recognized for his skill, his bravery, and his unwavering commitment. But there was a part of him, buried deep beneath the surface, that wasn't entirely comfortable with the attention. It wasn't just the media coverage that unsettled him. It was the sudden shift in the way people viewed him. For years, James had been the one who worked quietly in the background, never seeking recognition. He had never needed it. But now, the very thing he had longed for, validation, felt foreign, even uncomfortable. On the morning of the ceremony, James stood in front of the mirror in his firefighter uniform, his reflection staring back at him with a look of uncertainty. He was proud of what he had done, but there was a gnawing feeling deep in his chest that wouldn't go away. He had saved lives, yes. He had been the one to enter the fire when everyone else ran out. But it was the same act of heroism that had cost him something, a piece of his own sense of self. There was a knock on the door, and Mike entered, his usual grin plastered on his face. "You ready for this?" Mike asked, his voice light. "Big day today, huh? Hero of the hour." James forced a smile. "Yeah, I guess so." "You guess so?" Mike raised an eyebrow. "You don't sound too thrilled about it." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Mike. It's just all of this attention, the recognition. It doesn't feel the way I thought it would. You know what I mean?" Mike walked over and leaned against the doorframe, his expression softening. "I get it, man. I do. But you've earned this. You deserve it. You saved that family. You did something most people wouldn't even think of doing. You're a hero." James turned to face him, a quiet frustration in his eyes. "It's not just about that, though, is it? It's about proving something. It's about finally being seen for who I am. And I don't even know what that means anymore. Do I want to be seen as a hero, or do I just want to be seen as a firefighter? A good one? I've spent my whole life trying to show people what I can do, and now I don't know if that's enough. I don't know if it's ever been enough." Mike didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he straightened up, walking over to James and clapping him on the shoulder. "James," he said, his voice steady and serious, "the only thing you need to do is be yourself. And if you keep doing what you've been doing, saving lives, protecting this city, then that's all anyone needs to see. You've been enough all along. You don't need a competition or a medal or a ceremony to prove that." James looked at his best friend, and for the first time in days, he felt a weight lift off his chest. Mike was right. All he had ever wanted was to do his job to the best of his ability. He didn't need the accolades. He didn't need to be validated by others. The people who mattered already knew what he was capable of. "Thanks, man," James said, a small but genuine smile tugging at his lips. "I needed to hear that." Mike returned the smile and gave him a thumbs up. "Anytime. Now let's go get you that medal." The ceremony took place in the Grand Hall of the city's Civic Center, a space typically reserved for city council meetings, public events, and the occasional performance. It had been transformed for the occasion. Flags hung from the rafters, and a large banner reading, "Honoring Our Heroes," stretched across the back wall. Local politicians, city officials, and firefighters from all over the state gathered to celebrate the bravery of the first responders who had fought the fire. James felt out of place the moment he walked in. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the recognition. It was just that it felt like too much. The applause, the handshakes, the well-wishing, it was all a bit overwhelming. He'd never been one to crave the spotlight, and now, standing in front of so many people, he felt the weight of their expectations bearing down on him. He was introduced as the hero of the hour, and the applause that followed was deafening. The mayor of the city, a tall man in a sharp suit, gave a speech about bravery, sacrifice, and the importance of community. His words were kind, but they felt hollow to James, like they were meant to fill the empty space of his own confusion. As the mayor spoke, James's mind wandered back to the fire, the heat, the smoke, the families whose lives had been torn apart, and suddenly, it was hard to breathe. When it was his turn to speak, James stepped up to the podium, his palms sweating in his gloves. He had prepared something, some brief words of gratitude for the community, for his team, but as he looked out at the sea of faces, his mind went blank. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting for him to say something profound. But what could he say? What words would do justice to the family he had saved, to the people who had shown up for him in ways he hadn't imagined? There were no words that could capture the feeling of rushing into a burning building, of saving lives at the risk of your own. There were no words that could explain the sacrifice that came with the job, or the weight that came with the title of hero. "I don't know what to say," James finally said, his voice rough but steady. "I didn't do this for the recognition, for the applause. I did it because it's my job. It's what I was trained to do, and I'd do it again if it meant saving lives." He paused, glancing down at the medal the mayor was about to place around his neck. "I just want to thank my team, my family, and the people of this city for trusting me to do this job. I'm just a firefighter, and I'll always be just a firefighter." There was a long silence before the applause erupted again. But this time, James didn't feel uncomfortable. This time, he felt something else, something deeper. He felt the weight of the moment, but it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt right. As the ceremony ended, James stood in the back of the hall, watching the crowd disperse. He had done his duty. He had saved lives. And now, he could finally let go of the doubts that had plagued him for so long. Mike came over, clapping him on the back once more. You nailed it, man. Proud of you. James smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in days. Thanks, Mike. I'm proud of me too. And for the first time, he truly was. The days following the ceremony were quieter, but James still couldn't shake the feeling of being in the midst of a personal evolution. It wasn't just the recognition that had changed him. It was the realization that he had been living his life under the weight of something he hadn't fully understood. For years, he had sought to prove something to others. His worth, his ability to overcome the obstacles placed in his path because of his race, his background, and his history in the department. But now, standing on the other side of the fire, he understood that the real challenge had always been proving it to himself. The weight that had once crushed him now felt lighter. Like a burden he had been carrying for far too long had finally been set down. The accolades, the awards, the recognition, it had all been a reflection of his own battle with doubt. But now, as the days passed, he found himself focusing less on what the world thought of him and more on how he viewed himself. That quiet afternoon, a week after the ceremony, James sat in the station's break room, sipping coffee with Mike. The hum of the station was calm for once. No calls ringing through the air, no immediate fires to fight. Just the simple, everyday life of a firefighter, something James had grown to appreciate more and more. "So, what now?" Mike asked, leaning back in his chair. "You're a hero now, man. Got the medal, the city's recognition, the press. What's next? You gonna go for a promotion or something?" James chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm not in this for promotions. Never was." He paused, looking out the window at the calm street. "I just want to keep doing my job. Keep saving lives, that's all." Mike smiled. "Yeah, well, I think the city would be lucky to have you move up. But if that's not what you want, I get it. You've earned your place, no matter what." "I've earned my place," James repeated, nodding slowly. For the first time in his life, he believed it. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. He had found peace in the fact that being a firefighter, being a hero, wasn't about titles or recognition. It was about doing the job with everything you had and standing by your values no matter what. Just then, the fire bell rang. A fire alarm. Without hesitation, both of them jumped to their feet. The adrenaline surged instantly, and the station shifted into high gear. James grabbed his helmet, slipping it on. "We'll talk later," Mike said, his voice filled with anticipation. James nodded. "Yeah, let's go." The next few minutes were a blur. Sirens blared, the fire truck roared to life, and the team was out the door and racing down the streets, the familiar rush of adrenaline surging through his veins. The mission was simple. They were headed to a fire at a local apartment complex. It wasn't the biggest fire they had faced, but it was still dangerous, and every fire was a chance to save lives. As they pulled up to the scene, James's heart quickened. The apartment building was already engulfed in smoke, flames licking at the windows. People were standing outside, panicked, some yelling, others just standing in shock. A few people were trying to push their way into the building, but the firefighters quickly stopped them. James scanned the area, his mind already working through the logistics of the rescue. His job wasn't just about fighting fire. It was about assessing the situation and making sure everyone could get out alive. He moved with purpose, his body automatically falling into the routine he had perfected over the years. "Mike, we need to get in there," James said, his voice commanding. "The stairs are probably already blocked. We need to access the upper floors from the rear." Mike nodded, leading the way as they moved around to the back of the building. As they reached the rear entrance, James heard a voice calling out. It was a woman, screaming for help. Her voice was frantic, panicked. James's heart skipped a beat. There was something in the voice, a desperation, that made him move faster. He rushed to the door and kicked it open, stepping into the smoke-filled building. The heat was immediate, but James pushed forward, his training kicking in. "Help!" the voice cried again. It was coming from the second floor. James took the stairs two at a time, Mike right behind him. They reached the second-floor landing, and James motioned for Mike to take the left side while he went right. The smoke was thick, but they kept moving forward, using their flashlights to navigate the hallways. James's eyes scanned the rooms, the heat building with each step. He could hear coughing now, and then a figure emerged from a doorway. It was a young woman, maybe in her 20s, clutching a small child to her chest. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she looked like she couldn't breathe. "Please help us," she gasped, falling to her knees. James didn't hesitate. He rushed to her side, grabbing her arm to steady her. "Come on," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You need to move now." She nodded, still shaking, and James led her down the hallway, helping her to the stairs. But before they could get to the exit, the building groaned, and there was a loud crack, followed by the sound of collapsing wood. The ceiling above them began to fall apart, and James knew they were running out of time. He glanced down at the woman, who was holding onto the child as though her life depended on it. "Get to the exit now!" James shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "Go!" He pushed her toward the door, his eyes scanning for any signs of danger. The building was on the verge of collapse, and they didn't have much time. Mike reached the bottom of the stairs and turned to look up at them, his face tense. "James, we need to move. Now!" With one final push, James guided the woman and her child toward the door. He didn't stop to think about the danger. He didn't hesitate. He couldn't. They burst out of the building just as the roof collapsed, sending a massive wave of smoke and debris into the air. James was on his knees, gasping for breath, but the woman and her child were safe, and that was all that mattered. The aftermath was the same as it always was. Paramedics, police, and reporters arriving on the scene. The fire was finally under control, but James barely registered the chatter around him. He was too focused on the woman he had just saved, her tear-filled eyes locking with his in silent gratitude. "You're safe," he said to her, his voice hoarse. She nodded, her hands trembling as she held the child closer. "I don't know how to thank you. You saved us." James didn't need words. His eyes spoke the unspoken truth. He had done what he was trained to do. He had done what was needed. That was enough. As he walked away from the scene, the weight that had once consumed him felt lighter. The fire had been fierce, but his resolve had been stronger. He had come to understand that no matter how much the world changed, or how many accolades came his way, he would always be just one thing, a firefighter. And that was all he ever needed to be.